voyagers in search of the real thing.
To feel is human.
But to know is divine. Or at least, to have the kind of knowledge we moderns have, is what was once considered divine. Science has given us true knowledge of reality. We now have power because we've freed ourselves from the misleading perceptions of the human body.
That's a common way of seeing modern society. And it has led to our way of life in a culture based on scientific and technological practices. But another way of seeing modern society, called postmodern, says that modern society does not have unprecedented understanding of reality. It just has different values from other pre-modern human societies. The Mehinaku of Brazil have a typically pre-modern sense of values. Each year, they perform ritual ceremonies to ensure the success of the next crop. In one of them, the spirit of an anteater has to be beaten away.
But you don't have to do all this to grow a crop.
The Mehinaku know you have to plant a seed. But for them, even the functional business of planting is shaped by myths and rituals. They believe that their staple crop first grew from the sexual organs of a great alligator, which had been killed by Mehinaku men for having sex with two Mehinaku girls. Now, when seed is to be planted, the alligator is drawn in the soil and its spirit is summoned. Pre-moderns see themselves as involved in a great order of being, which gives purpose and direction to life.
Precisely. But superstitiously seeing all these purposes in nature is what we moderns have left behind. The West itself once had pre-modern values. For Christians, the world is still ordered by divine purpose. But for most of us, that's now history, part of the medieval world picture which saw human purpose written in the universe.
They had a picture of the world which had been created by a god who had designed the various species of things, and in particular had created human beings as one among others to live a particular kind of life in a pattern which had as it were, the authority of the universe behind it. It had the authority of God. There's an authority of the universe which says, this is the way this sort of creature is meant to live. And is meant to there means something like almost having a part in a play or playing an instrument in an orchestra. It's been designed. There's a teleology. There's a purpose in the world. And our job is to live as rational animals in a particularly human way.
We moderns have freed ourselves from delusions about gods. Since about the start of the 17th century, science has shown that the world is a kind of vast mechanism, governed by physical forces, nothing to do with gods. Nobody now thinks that the cosmos is trying to talk to us.
You have this abstract, disengagedly regarded, perhaps you also think, mechanical universe. And the goods, as it were, have to be put into it by human sentiment and human choice. Now that gives you a different picture of a moral order. Because the natural picture you draw from of a moral order you draw from what I very broadly call the medieval picture is you try to find out what you're supposed to be doing and do it as best you can. Now you're not being given by the universe what you're supposed to be doing.
You moderns now live lives shaped by the belief that you are detached from the universe. Nature is just mechanical.
That's right. The natural world is just composed of fields of force and energy, governed by laws.
The only laws for modern humans now are the laws of physics. You think that the universe belongs by right to whoever penetrates its mysteries through reason.
You're being melodramatic and sentimental. The natural world is just an inert resource which we can conquer and exploit, if we want.
Modern power binds nature to man's service. It has become his slave, his instrument. You think power is good because you think it equals understanding and truth.
There are ideals of ourselves as free beings, as beings whose freedom consists in being able to stand over against nature and, in a sense, liberate ourselves from it and peel back on ourselves and see what we want and what we desire, and then being able to take an instrumental stance to the world and bring about what we desire, right? So as soon as I start treating something as an instrument, it ceases to define my goals for me, and I'm defining them independently of that. So the instrumental stance has great appeal to us. It appeals to certain ideals of freedom, certain ideals of self-dependence, self-generation, heroic aspect, Promethean aspect. All those images are very strong in our civilization, and here they get bound up with the prestige of science, right?
Achieving heroic conquest has become an end in itself. Ex-President Reagan was just one modern who gave voice to this way of seeing heroic modern man.
In the future, as in the past, our freedom, independence, and national well-being will be tied to new achievements, new discoveries, and pushing back new frontiers.
Modern man thinks he's completely free. He thinks the cosmos doesn't tell him what to do. But he does behave as if destiny is written in science. Destiny has created a special role for him. Disembodied reason, the way he accesses truth, is a male attribute. Women, ever heard of feminine intuition? Feeling and imagination and all the female weaknesses are surplus to the real business of modernism. She's not in the picture because she's the brains behind the car. Heroic men have cut free from the restrictive practices of pre-modernism. Reason has freed the individual to choose his own ethical values. Men have disentangled themselves from the irrational superstitions of religion. Religion has tried to survive, however, by itself appealing to rationalism. Protestantism, for example, the form which has flourished in the modern age, reshaped Christianity to allow the individual access to God through reason.
In the entire Western world, particularly from the period of the Enlightenment, the notion that religious views, along with all other traditional views, moral, etc., had to be tested against rational standards, and often those standards meant scientific standards, led to a conception of religious belief as a set of propositions that were either rationally defensible or even empirically defensible. And probably that obscured pretty seriously the real meaning of what those religious symbols carried in the life of a community.
Myth and ritual are important to all humans. They give shape and purpose to a life. Moderns think that myths are just false understanding and that reason has done away with the need for them. But isn't a sense of scientific progress towards truth our myth? Progress is seen as a grand narrative theme of modern history. But this theme has strange echoes of the great myth of the pre-modern West.
The grand narrative is directly linked with a certain type of religious belief, which is called the revelation. The notion of revelation means that the God has addressed us. The secularized version of the religion, that's to say Enlightenment, maintained the structure, the general shape of the promise. But finally, the promise is no longer given by God. It's appealing from the end of history. You know? But finally, there is no big difference.
Everything looking good. Altitude 4200. Houston, you're go for landing, over.
I think we moderns can say our achievements justify our sense of progress. Landing on the moon wasn't a myth.
You may have achieved great technological power, but the question is, do you have that power because you understand the truth about reality? What is truth?
Contact light. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
The American philosopher William James said, true is just a name for what is good in the way of belief. And I think this is a helpful way of thinking of it. true is not a property which a sentence or a belief has because it mirrors reality. It's a property which a sentence or a belief has because it's a useful tool for human purposes. A good belief for us to have, a true belief, is just a belief which will get us what we want. And what we want in science is ways of predicting and controlling nature. So a true scientific theory is one that gives us such ways, and a better science, to say that one scientific theory is better than another is just to say it gives us more such instruments of control. So I think the more honest way of thinking about science is just as a human tool rather than as a way of putting us in relation with an absolute reality in the way in which religion claimed to put us in touch with an absolute reality.
What Rorty says means that there is no right way to look at the world. That must be nonsense. The Nuer of the Sudan believe that spirits cause disease. During a smallpox epidemic, they appeal to Deng, god of the sky, for his help. Part of the ceremony consisted of sacrificing precious bullets to this god. Typically pre-modern superstitious nonsense. If you want to defeat a disease, break open the science. Proof? We have now eradicated smallpox.
The Nuer may not have had your power to defeat smallpox, but that doesn't make their understanding of reality inferior to your modern understanding. The Nuer are only wrong if you use the modern definition of reality.
We know a lot about how organisms reproduce. And we know, for example, how to prevent conception. And you might think that if science, again, were just a matter of take it or leave it, that what we should be able to do is to prevent contraception in all kinds of different ways. For example, by just willing, I will not conceive, or what have you. Well, that doesn't work that way. You have to actually intervene in the causal process that's understood very clearly by science. And waving broccoli over your tummy or standing under the moon in a certain configuration or willing very hard doesn't work. Reality is out there, and it impresses itself upon you, and it won't just let you make things up, and it won't just let you create an idea and then decide that that's reality.
Reality sounds straightforward. But we all know that there's a real world where you bump into things. But how should humans look at this world? What's really in it?
Simple. Truth is accurate representation of the world regardless of what we think about it. If we're objective, nothing comes between us and the world.
But something does get between us and the world. Language and human ideas. You think that language is like a window. You just look at the world through it. But human language doesn't start by labeling the various items in the world. You don't see a shark and the word shark pops up. You can't even tell whether that thing over there is a shark without a background understanding of what distinguishes a shark from a space shuttle. Language provides that background. Language is a complex interconnecting system which makes up reality for humans. You can't separate one strand of language from the rest of the net of interconnected ideas from which it's made.
We're really immersed in language. We learn to think, even to understand what a world is like in the first place, because we're taught a certain language. Each individual term of that language, some individual terms we might sort of focus on very closely and see exactly what they mean and define our terms, But each individual term of language we only have a grip on because of the whole background of other terms, of ways of talking, of ways of relating to others in language, of ways of conversing, and so on. And that whole background is taken for granted as we focus on one term.
There's nowhere we can start and say, this is a neutral picture of reality, untouched by human brains, without any background of human ideas. If you have to accept that the human linguistic background is always there, you also have to accept that we can only get a human idea of what's in the world. For better, for worse, the net of language is what makes our world. Not even science can get outside the human picture of the world to see reality as it is in itself. Even science is a human picture of the world.
The Enlightenment suggested that the scientist could step back to a neutral standpoint which had nothing to do with any human needs and simply see reality plain. And that's something no human being can do. There's no such thing as becoming independent of human needs and getting into direct, unmediated contact with nature by assuming a neutral attitude. All you can do is put together instruments for human purposes, and some of those instruments are what we call scientific theories. The choice between scientific theories is a choice between better and worse instruments, more or less efficient instruments for prediction and control. There's no neutral criterion called representation of reality which takes precedence over predictive ability.
Modern culture thought it had achieved the true picture of reality, free from human values. But even science needs humans to interpret data, and that requires human hypotheses to determine just what are data. Humans don't get in the way of science. They see the world in the way that makes science possible. But that's the crucial point. Science is about one way of choosing to see the world. The only way a modern can see the world is in terms of physical causes and effects, mass and energy and forces. That's the language of science. And it's now deeply entrenched in our culture that by seeing the world in terms of physical causes and effects, we are describing reality in itself.
Since the Enlightenment, it's been customary to think of science as getting at reality as it is in itself. The idea seems to be that if a poet describes a field of daffodils as a field of daffodils, that's just the way it looks to human beings, whereas if the physicist describes the same field in terms of elementary particles or physical forces, that's nature's own way of describing it. And I think it would help us if we got rid of the notion of nature's own way of describing itself and just said that the poet serves certain human needs by talking about the daffodils and the physicist serves certain human needs by talking about the forces and the particles, but there is nothing less human about the physicist's description than about the poet's.
How we see reality depends on different human purposes. Describing a visit by the Kaiser to an orphanage in 1910 in terms of elementary particles would probably mystify your audience. How humans see the world always depends on seeing what matters to them. And that can lead to a lot of different ways of seeing the world. Seeing good and bad. Seeing private property. Seeing suffering and compassion.
This is my body.
which will be
Even seeing God, perhaps.
for you.
Try to understand the conflicting views in Northern Ireland in terms of elementary particles. You won't get far. Human needs and values shape how we see the world. They create rules for ways of looking at the world. Human lives are shaped by behavior which is only meaningful if done in particular ways. Races are run according to particular rules. But all rules are the expression of values. So which values are we going to use to see reality? That's the problem. Different humans have different ideas of which values are appropriate. They have different rules for seeing reality. There is no way of looking at the world which is value-free. There is no neutral foundation on which we can build certain knowledge about reality.
We know that in the general theory of knowledge, when we're talking about science and other, what sorts of knowledge we can have of the world, there have been these projects in the past which are foundationalist. That is, in the sense they have tried to find one foundation for all of knowledge and construct it upwards. Now, at the present time, I think we're probably, most of us agreed, and I'm sure many people who appeared in your programs will agree, that foundationalism as a general project for science and knowledge isn't very encouraging. It doesn't have much of a press these days, and certainly one of the things that changes that's occurred in the last 30 or 40 years is that belief in foundationalism has greatly declined. And now people think much more in terms, when they're thinking about science or knowledge in general, they think much more, don't they, in terms of a holistic picture, trying to get it to hang together in the most sensible way.
Pretty bad news if there's no certain way to get things to hang together. Anything goes. Chaos. Which subjective delusion are we going to believe today? Truth is a meaningless concept. It's just a label we use for whatever we want to believe. Worse still, it'll be whatever more powerful people try to make us believe. Might becomes right. So many different cultures, so many different beliefs and values. What happens when they decide to assert themselves and say that they're right? How can we avoid violent chaos?
The human animal is immensely expressive. Human cultures show infinite ways of marking distinctions. But the modern age distrusts any human culture. It gets in the way of true knowledge of the world. It is so much feeling and imagination, false meaning, dressing up. To know reality truly, you should strip away culture to find a truth purified of human needs and purposes. But this overlooks the degree to which culture makes us human. Take off the apparently superficial clothing of culture, and there's only a naked animal with nothing to say.
The Enlightenment suggested that if we could get rid of particular accidents of culture and get back to nature, then you would be more rational. But there's no such thing as getting away from culture. There's simply choosing one form of life over another form of life, or finding a form of life which better suits your purposes than a previous form of life.
For moderns, only a very narrow kind of reason can know reality truly. Human animals have rational consciousness which detects truth, and this faculty is somehow non-human. But dismissing other equally human meanings as illegitimate overlooks just how much culture makes humans. Humans are by constitution creative, expressive animals who make up meanings. This isn't a scientific observation of a swan approaching death. You might say that culture is what defines human beings, and each human being is defined by his or her specific culture.
Before human beings are acculturated, before they're brought up modern Europeans or ancient Chinese or ancient Greeks, they are just animals. They are perfectly plastic to the influences of parents, the environment, and so on. There is nothing deep within every human being which makes him or her an individual in his or her own right. There are simply individual ancient Greeks, individual ancient Chinese, individual modern Europeans.
So what shapes a culture? It's all about food and sex, isn't it? Perpetuating the species.
No. Human culture is a creative response to the world. It's about more than bare necessities. Take the Nuer. Their lives are hard. Sub-Saharan Africa is a tough environment. Cattle provide most of their needs. Food, fuel. The cattle are important for their survival. But even here, there's room for a great deal more than physical survival. The Nuer even have values which might appear to diminish their chances of survival. Sometimes, such as when someone is possessed, the Nuer believe that it is necessary to sacrifice one of their extremely valuable cattle, perhaps in order to placate a god. In the West, this would be the equivalent of someone deliberately destroying his or her most prized possession, perhaps their car, for example. The Nuer don't lead lives which can be merely reduced to the problems of survival. Does any human?
You can't predict, from looking at the nature of the environment in which they're living, what particular form the culture will take. All you can say is that if people are going to interact with each other in a meaningful way, if people are going to be able to conceive of their place in the world, they are going to need to construct a set of meanings. And those meanings must be consistent with the practical problems which are posed for them by their environment, but they cannot be reduced to those practical problems.
Human life has amounted to more than practical problems since we lived in caves.
But humans create different meanings, which conflict. Chaos follows if none are true.
Conflict only threatens if you dismiss other ways of seeing the world as disordered and without purpose. All human ways of seeing the world have their own rules and reasons. The fact of human communication, sharing worlds through language and gesture, ties us into ways of seeing meaning which order the world. Language creates meaning and order. These Trobriand islanders in the Pacific are preparing for a form of ritual combat between villages. The actual form of the combat is something that we, the natives of an island some 11,000 odd miles away, will probably recognize. The Trobrianders have embellished the game we know, however. Sides can consist of up to 60 players. It's considered courteous for the home side to win, though not by too big a margin. Is it cricket? It's similar to the game played at Lord's, but its rules have been adapted for Trobriand purposes. It's how the Trobrianders order and perform part of their lives. Every way of life has rules for performance, but life is the performance, not the rules. Even in cricket, people actually have to do things. Bowlers bowl and batsmen bat. Rules express shared values which make certain kinds of performance possible. But in human culture, there's always a peculiarly elastic relationship between rules and performance. Human creativity through language.
You get a structure of human life in which the possibility of individual creativity and change is systematically, by very nature, built in. In a sense, what we have is an interplay, therefore, between the individual creating and the social whole and social code in which he or she creates. You can't start with either of these alone. You just totally miss the point. The individual couldn't create without the code there. The code only exists as it does because of all the acts of creation. And any theory which says, okay, we're going to start with the individual, now we're going to build to the whole, is completely forgetting that the individual can only exist and operate as a human individual within the code. Anyone who says we start with the code, like certain kind of structuralism, and individual simply derives from this, completely forgets that the code is only a living code because it's constantly renewed in activity.
Whatever kind of cricket you play will have some rules. By following rules, cultures establish the conventions which create meaning. Unless they followed some rules, humans would just be upright animals incapable of seeing any meaning or value or truth. All meanings are only human. Reason isn't detached from human beings. Human behavior is not about measuring truth. Much of it expresses values through human engagement with the world, performing a life. Peruvian Indians, for example, finding meaning in this ritual marriage of a condor and a bull. Culture enables. It gives shape to human lives.
Yes, different shapes in different cultures.
But the fact of difference isn't dangerous. It's intolerance that is.
Look, you want to allow any old meaning into the picture. Anything goes. Take your Nua. They restrict ownership of their all-important cattle to adult men. You become an adult by being marked in a gruesome way. Well, that's not for me. What's dangerous is that people get attached to their meanings. They start to believe that they're true. I don't want to be made to accept strange delusions about what's in the world.
No one's forcing you to believe anything. This is just how the newer shape their lives. It makes sense within the totality of a newer life. But even though we can see human purpose in lives like these, we're not compelled to accept these values. But if we choose other values, we shouldn't fool ourselves about the reasons. The justifications, even for a scientific culture, are also human. We only ever have human reasons.
Well, if you go with this view that I'm putting forward today, the view that you can reason about human affairs, you can reason about ethics, you can reason about art, but it's this peculiar kind of reasoning where you don't have this world out there that can be identified independently of all our descriptions and then compare various descriptions with them in order to find the right one. But it works by these arguments where you take one view and then you argue another view is better, transition. You get a kind of peculiar status of the conclusions of this argument. They're never, if you like, categorical and absolute. They're always comparative and provisional.
Provisional claims aren't meaningless. You just have to accept them as you accept the rules of cricket. Human meaning is partly what a culture has come to accept about the world. And violent conflict doesn't have to flow from people accepting different meanings. If you're worried about other people believing their own truths, the fact is, we're all in the same position as humans. Nobody has any transcendental justifications. It's actually the claim that you are certain about the truth which contains the greatest threat of violence. You become intolerant of other meanings and try to suppress them.
A strong desire for certainty. It's a sort of other compensation, and we need certainty. That's true. But it seems to me that we have to resist this need, which is the source of ideologies, dogmatism, and so on, which is very dangerous. We have to assume the uncertainty as such. That's a condition for morality, thinking, even research, even knowledge. Imagine a scientist certain of an hypothesis. It's finished. It's impossible to continue.
We only ever have provisional truths. And these are model postmodern human beings with provisional ideas about truth. They're scientists. Most scientists will readily admit that they're constantly having to change their ideas about reality. If ever they were certain about a theory, it would make it impossible to devise a new and possibly better theory. Where would Einstein be if we all had been certain that Newton was absolutely right? Everything's always up for grabs in science. But it doesn't mean that we can't carry on, believing what's useful, even if it may change later. We can't live our lives without meaning. We just have to accept that there are no absolute truths.
Postmodernism is often misunderstood in its analysis and critique of meaning. The point is not that Meaning is simply to be overthrown. In a certain sense, we are condemned to search for meaning. The dilemma, one way of understanding the postmodern dilemma, is that belief is both unavoidable and yet impossible. That is to say, we cannot not believe, and yet belief is never grounded in anything other than our own venture, as it were. Therefore, we must at one and the same time believe and yet constantly be critical of those beliefs because we are aware of their inadequacy and insufficiency.
So what will postmoderns believe? Will you just play with different myths as they suit you?
I can't say who'll believe what. Different humans will value different expressions. Myths will change as our needs and values change. That's just to recognize that humans are flexible animals. At the same time, it would be more honest to say that change has always been driven by our needs, rather than because our culture found out how to read the secrets of the universe.
Our culture permits us to do things which our ancestors couldn't do. It permits us to aim at a classless society. It permits us to have a scientific view which is not cluttered up with religious considerations. It permits us to have a view of the world which is experimental, constantly changing, constantly being readapted to meet our needs, and it permits us to change our needs as we see what it's possible for us to do. That kind of flexibility is what we ought to mean by rationality, but unfortunately, because of the Enlightenment tradition, we still think of rationality as a neutral faculty which has nothing to do with our needs, our passions, or our interests.
And for a glimpse into the future, over to another exhibition in Knightsbridge, and a home that should suit women drivers.
Will we still bow down to the great god, technology? If science is not the only measure of true understanding, perhaps not.
Flick of a switch and Fred takes over. Tomorrow's House Beautiful is well nigh perfect, but a few snags need ironing out. Whoops. And so to bed after a tiring day keeping a watchful eye on the robots.
Technology. That modern dream of heaven.
Hang on. Everybody now agrees that we have to look after the environment.
Sure. Greenery is fashionable. But postmodernism is about more than how to improve our technology and the management of scarce resources. That would be to shore up modern ambitions. The question is, how should we behave as humans? Should we measure our lives by our control over the world? The real debate about the environment starts with your view of what it is to be human.
I think around whether you go with this ethical impulse for instrumental reason and control or you don't hangs one of the most important struggles in our civilization between not just two ethics, but two whole sensibilities, two whole fields about the world and human life. And we see it all the time being fought out between people who are technological boosters against people who have very strong ecological consciousness, right? That's the main issue. You see being fought out between them something much more than just different hunches about what's going to work out for human survival. You see whole views about what being human is in contest in these battles, right?
Where we start for our view of what it is to be human is always going to be open to debate.
The nature of rationality is as much up for grabs as everything else. From the point of view of certain cultures, our culture, our modern European culture, seems wildly irrational. From the point of view of our culture, certain primitive cultures seem absurd. But what we shouldn't do is think that if only we try hard enough, we can find something non-cultural, a human nature which is neutral between us and the alternative culture, and use that as a court of appeal. We are nothing except what our culture has made us, just as they are nothing except what their culture has made us. And neither of us are right or wrong about what rationality is in itself, because there's no such thing as rationality as it is in itself. There is simply a certain way of being a human being as opposed to other ways of being a human being.
We are our bodies. Why do we choose one way of responding to the world over another? Many ways in which bodies behave and respond, rejected by modern culture, may be appropriate if you see being human differently. Seeing humans differently might mean you'd look at religious behavior differently too. But that's for next week.
And the concluding part of The Real Thing can be seen next Sunday at 8:30. There's a Channel 4 booklet to accompany the series. For a copy, send a cheque or postal order for £2.50, payable to Channel 4 to The Real Thing, P.O. Box 4000, London W3 6XJ.